Hello folks, and welcome again to the Reality Rope Access channel, where today we will be providing some useful information on the topic of knots and hitches used specifically for residential rope access. But before we begin, allow me to thank our sponsor, Damon Hawkins over at Steep Gear, who provides us with our Steep Gear gloves. These gloves, quite possibly the most useful product for hand safety and increased grip strength for both roof and rope, without compromising the dexterity of my 6 most important digits. And let me tell all of you aggressive slope footwear fanatics, if you believe in the power of cougar paws for your feet, then you are going to love these gecko palms for your hands. Our program today is focused on 5 knots and 1 hitch, which are essentially 6 different tools for building and using lifeline ropes over residential structures. Why so many? Well, we must understand that every dwelling is unique with respect to roofing type, pitch, shape, and usable anchor points. Therefore, the more knots, i.e. rope tools, that we know, the better prepared we will be for addressing the challenges presented by the field. So let's start with the type of strength-rated cordage that we will be using to demonstrate our knots and hitches today, which for our primary double anchor lifeline and secondary pivot line will be a Blue Water 2, a low elongation Kern mantle rope that exceeds OSHA and ANSI 5,000 pound standards for fall protection, with a 10.5 millimeter diameter, so it is compatible with all of our rope access gear components. We will also be using some 1-inch tubular webbing, a critical component to our collection of gear because of its unique properties, distinct and separate from that of rope, including but not limited to its 4,000 pound end-to-end strength and its 6,800 pound loop strength when combined with a water knot. And lastly, our 6.5 millimeter dynamic prusik cord that partners up nicely with our 10.5 millimeter primary ropes to provide a multi-directional fall protection tool with 1,700 pounds of grip before it slips strength. Another fact worth noting is that while knots represent bends or folds in our rope that on average will reduce our rope strength by about 1/3, hitches represent a means of securing the ends of a rope with little or no loss in rope strength. The simplest knot known to mankind is called an overhand knot, a knot that we like to call the pretzel knot because that is the shape it forms when it is tied correctly. Tying this knot begins by forming a shape known as a bight. A single bight of rope is then transformed into a loop of rope, which is then transformed into the shape of a pretzel by passing one end of the rope through the center of the loop and dressed into the working shape of an overhand knot. Keep in mind that the process by which we tie this knot is the general process by which we will tie our double overhand locking knot and our water knot, which might appear complicated, however, are nothing more than a slight variation on the simplest knot known to mankind. If the overhand knot is the simplest knot known to mankind, then the next simplest knot would probably be the figure 8 knot, a double loop in the shape of an 8 that is distinctly different from the single loop of an overhand knot. To tie it, we will begin with a single bight of rope that we will transform into a loop, but instead of threading it straight up through our loop like we did with our overhand knot, we will allow for an extra half rotation to form the shape that could not be mistaken for anything other than a figure of 8. Do your best to remember this process as you progress through this video, because 2 of our rope access knots, the Super 8 and the figure of 8 follow through, are both considered figure-of-8 style knots. Now, before we begin our rope access knots, let's begin with a few fundamentals of rope management and terminology. Long pieces of cordage like our 200-foot primary lifeline rope have a tremendous potential for tangles, which we can pretty much eliminate if we will simply store it in a bag or container by feeding it in from the bottom end of the rope to the top end, a process known as stacking. Another wise management technique is the ability to access both ends of the rope by attaching them to the handles of your container, with a single overhand knot representing the top end of the rope and a double overhand knot representing the bottom end of the rope. Managing your rope in this manner not only makes it simple to extract and use the precise amount of rope needed for each uniquely different access structure, but it also allows us to efficiently put away or stack our rope so it is ready to deploy on the next structure that we will need to use it on. Next, we should identify the terms for the two different parts of rope that you will be using. The working end is a small portion of rope that you will be working with to tie your knots, while the standing end represents the much larger body of rope opposite to the working end. Remember that muscle memory is our goal, which will require a consistent process of repetitive order. One method of achieving this is to hold the rope with your non-dominant hand, with your palm down and wrist frozen, which will provide a steady platform to tie your knot with your dominant hand. Now allow me to introduce the term and concept of redundancy, which is essentially the incorporation of additional safety procedures used for the specific purpose of eliminating the all too common potential for human error. Redundancy will be utilized in many different ways to mitigate the effects of human error in our residential rope access systems. However, the redundant process that we will use for our knots will appear in the form of an additional slip-style overhand knot just below our primary knot. And here is an excellent reason why redundancy is important. Humans have the potential for tying their knots incorrectly, a condition that can and does lead to rope access system failure. But if we incorporate the addition of a redundant double overhand locking knot with a minimum 4-inch working end tail to prevent pull-through, we can easily eliminate the potential for human error by creating what we like to call a bomb-proof connection point. So let's go ahead and tie a Super 8 knot, also known as a bunny knot, which is an excellent knot for use with carabiners and load-shared anchors. The characteristics of a Super 8 knot include 2 connection loops that project out of the top of the 8, 2 loops at the top of the 8 itself, and 3 loops at the bottom of the 8. As with most knots, the process of tying the Super 8 will begin with a single bite of rope. Hold that single bite in your dominant hand and then reach your non-dominant hand over to form a double bite, remembering to keep your palm down and wrist frozen for a stable and consistent tying platform. And while doing so, let's make sure that the single bite, which is now upside down, is directly in front of our dominant tying hand. Now let's swing that single bite 1 full rotation around our working and standing ends, then form another double bite of rope, which will essentially form our bunny ears, then bring those bunny ears through the top of your 8 and stage your hands. Staging your hands is a critical step in this knots tying process, where we will be grasping a single bite on one side of our 8 and a double bite on the other. Holding the rope in this manner is significant because if we don't, our knot will simply fall apart and we will have to begin the whole process again. We will finish this knot by bringing our dominant hand up through the single bite, reach over the top of our 8, then secure the double bite bunny ears, which will provide us with a free hand to lift that single bite from our wrist up and over the bunny ears and all the way down to the bottom of our 8. Now allow me to mention the fact that a Super 8 knot does without question represent a bomb-proof connection point for our lifeline rope, but only to the extent that we did indeed tie it correctly. And the consistent accuracy to tie our knots correctly can only be achieved with muscle memory, which is essentially a reflex process that is so familiar that it requires little, if any, thought. Kind of like the way that most of us tie our shoes, because although it probably seemed difficult while learning as a child, the process itself was repeated so many times that it quickly became an easy and mindless routine. However, muscle memory will not happen without repetition and lots of it. For most people, this will require the practice of tying your knots 300 to 500 times, which might seem as a daunting task, but can literally be achieved in a couple of hours. That said, we understand that some people will be committed to achieving muscle memory. However, many will not, and this is exactly why we promote the use of a redundant locking knot as cheap but effective insurance to guard against the possibility for human error. But make no mistake, the double overhand is far from limited to that of just a redundant locking knot. Its usefulness extends to securing a rope to a connector, joining two ropes together, securing the end of a tensionless hitch, and of course, identifying and providing access to the bottom end of a stacked rope. So let's demonstrate the tying of this double overhand knot on a bight of rope, which is also known as a scaffold knot, which is also known as a slip knot. Like most knots, this knot too will begin with a single bight of rope that we will shift to our holding hand with the curved end of the bight positioned towards our body. Next, we will wrap our working end 2 times around the standing end of our rope towards our body, which means our double loops will cross over each other and form an X. Now, with your thumb pointing the way, follow the direction of that thumb with the working end of your rope through the double crisscross loops, dress, tighten, and verify the tail length of 4 inches, which is approximately the width of your palm. And with that, there are many things we could do with that scaffold knot, like adding a carabiner, which we can then stabilize and secure in a fixed direction to prevent the potential for rollout, which we can then secure to an appropriate anchor point. So let's take a minute to discuss rollout, which is basically any unintended force on a carabiner that would cause its gate to open, because this is a term that segues nicely into our figure 8 follow-through knot. Connectors like these carabiners are critical components to any rope access system for securing our connections to rope, belay hardware, anchors, and harness. However, carabiners have gates, and gates can sometimes open without our permission given the right amount of force and direction. Here we can see that even a 3-stage carabiner that requires 3 distinctly different actions of lifting, rotating, and depressing to open is still vulnerable to rollout given the correct angle and force. But the figure 8 follow-through knot offers us the ability to make a direct connection to many different things without the need for a carabiner. Tying a figure 8 follow-through knot begins by creating a single 8 knot, which becomes our template to copy or follow back through with our working end after we have captured a closed loop or pretty much any other object. This single 8 can be created in 3 different ways, which are the hold and wrap technique, the double twist technique, and the flip and dart, which is a timing sensitive technique requiring cat-like reflexes to spear your prey when the opportunity arises. So let's finish this knot now by passing our working end through our connection point, then copying our single 8 template until our working end of the rope is pointing the same direction as the standing end of our rope. Now let's get into the water knot, which is a flat cordage knot that we will be tying on 1-inch tubular webbing, which is flat cordage that has some physical properties uniquely different from that of our rope, which makes it a very useful component of our rope access gear package. The water knot is a pretzel style knot that is similar to our figure 8 follow through in the sense that we will be creating a template with one end of our webbing first and then copying it with the other. We will begin this knot by forming a single bight of webbing with approximately 14 inches of slack on the working end. We will then form a loop and pass our working end through the loop to create our overhand template knot, i.e. the simplest knot known to mankind, making sure that our template knot is flat and loose so it'll be easy to copy. Next, we will take the other end of our webbing and copy our template knot, a process that will begin by passing the new end past the original end and under a single bridge. Copy your template knot as it is created and you will find yourself approaching a double bridge, which you will need to go under to complete your water knot. Our bomb-proof redundancy for our flat cordage knots will be the same as for our rope cordage knots, with the exception that they will be a single overhand knot rather than a double overhand knot. And there will be 2 of them, consisting of 1 on each side of our primary knots. And to wrap up our lesson on webbing knots, we will demonstrate what we call a cheater water knot, which provides us with a very quick way to secure a loop on our webbing to limit the travel distance of our carabiners. Next on our list is the Alpine butterfly, which is a knot we can use to load a rope in 3 different directions. So we could add a secondary lifeline like this pivot line, or we can use it to isolate any damaged area along our rope. Now, there are several different ways to tie this knot correctly, but we will be demonstrating the best way for tying it along a rope which is already secured to an anchor, or essentially the way which is most useful to us in the field. We will begin this knot by forming 2 loops around our hand with a little extra slack for good measure. And let's pay close attention to this black spot of rope, because although it begins in the middle of our 3 lines in the palm of our hand, its order will soon shift towards your fingertips, then up, over, and under the other 2 lines of rope to form our Alpine butterfly knot. And now we will create a prusik hitch with some 6.5 millimeter dynamic prusik cordage that is joined together at the ends with 2 opposite and opposing triple overhand locking knots with around 1 inch of tail slack that will fit together just like adjoining puzzle pieces to provide us with the least expensive and quite possibly the most useful belay device in our rope access kit. We will tie our prusik hitch by placing our prusik cord underneath our 10.5 millimeter rope and then passing our locking knots through our open end bite 3 times. Next, we will tension our hitch by pulling from the left or right side of our locking knots to skew them away from our carabiner connection point. Then we will dress our hitch into 6 perfect loops with this horseshoe portion to the outside of our hitch and our harness connection lines to the inside. When tied and used correctly, we can take full advantage of a multi-directional 1,700-pound grip before it slips strength tool, which is very handy for securing our bodies anywhere along our lifeline, which is especially important for our security during our transitions over the ridge cap area. And we will conclude our presentation with a tensionless hitch that we like to secure with an overhand knot, which is a knot that we have already demonstrated, so for the sake of time, we will not be showing again. A tensionless hitch is by far the best way to secure a rope to any anchor that does not threaten to damage our rope with a direct connection. Like, say, the damage we could incur from creosote contamination to our rope, or shear damage from right-angled edges, or the exposure to grease and sharp edges of a wheel anchor. The benefits of the tensionless hitch connection include its simplicity. Just wrap your rope 3 times around something 4 times the diameter of your rope and secure the end. Its strength. The strength of this connection hitch is stronger than the rope itself. And finally, it decreases the amount of stress applied to the ends of your rope where it is most vulnerable to wear and damage.